Welcome to Thrive in the Future podcast. Positive solutions to help you thrive, homestead, garden, and designing your intentional life. Welcome back to Thrive in the Future. I have Ashley Colby with me. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Scott. Glad to be here.
So give a little background about yourself.
Sure. Okay, so I am an American. I grew up in Chicago. I went on a whole sort of weird trajectory that included getting a scholarship to a fancy university, then kind of dropping out a little bit and traveling the world for a while. Truck driver, 18-wheel truck driver for a little bit, then went to grad school and got my PhD focused on environmental sociology. And I for that, talk to people who produce food for their own consumption in Chicago, where I'm from.
Wow.
And that work and the PhD and that whole trajectory of my adulthood kind of got me convinced to move out of the US. So my husband and I bought some land in Uruguay. We have 9 acres and 3 little girls. And for work, I host American university students here in Uruguay on like a cultural exchange where they work with local farmers. They do some natural building, alternative sanitation projects, things like that, so they can learn hands-on, what sustainability looks like in practice here. And then I teach some sociology with that. And then, my own podcast is the Doomer Optimism podcast. And I think similar themes to yours, just talking to people who are exploring resilience in various ways and just kind of talking to them about what they're learning and what are the best practices and what are their pitfalls and all of that kind of stuff. So basically the life and work are all part of a similar kind of trajectory vocation that's towards, resilient sustainability, and trying to figure out, I guess, like the way to live a good life.
Sure. So how did you choose Uruguay? What was the deciding factors?
Yeah. So my husband before we moved here, was a high school Spanish teacher, and he taught in college too. And we both studied abroad and, kind of had the idea that living abroad would be a good idea for various reasons. That's not the part you asked me, but why we chose Uruguay, we had a short list and it was very nerdy. It was very spreadsheet brain. This is one of my terms that I have coined, which is thinking about everything in terms of like, lists and data and that kind of thing. But, we looked at things like political stability, social stability, like access to fresh water, sea level rise, soil quality, all this kind of, access to universal healthcare was a really big one, because in the US, it's kind of like this treadmill where you have to be working to be able to get healthcare, or the deductibles can ruin you and this kind of thing. And I just wanted to be out of that treadmill so that we could have a little bit more freedom to choose work in a more flexible way and still have access to healthcare, good education, and then be able to speak the language or learn it. Spanish is like, my husband obviously is an expert Spanish speaker and teacher, and Spanish is easy to learn, like easier than Romanian or something.
And the rules are real straightforward. Yep.
Yes, and like for an English speaker, it's not very hard. And then being able to immigrate, cost of living, like the immigration process is really hard for Americans in Europe, for example, but it's not very hard here at all, because Uruguay is kind of like it's like a crossroads between Brazil and Argentina, in the sense that a lot of people have second homes here, and those are like much bigger countries, and this is kind of like the vacation country for a lot of those people in Brazil and Argentina. And so there's just really lax rules for owning property and residency and that kind of thing. It was really easy relative to other places. Lots of paperwork, but really like easy and straightforward.
Yeah. So how did you get universal health care being an expat?
So everybody gets it, even if you're like newly, I mean, probably not if you're on a tourist visa, but even if you're like newly applying for residency, everybody has access to universal health care. here. And then the way we pay into it, or the way it's typically paid into, is I think for rural, it's either through your job, you have to pay some sort of taxes, or if you live rurally, and a lot of people here are their main job is rural production, either farming or self production for self-consumption. And so we pay for the health insurance through our property taxes, and it works out to like $200 a month for our family of 5, which is great. And there's no such thing as a deductible, and like our copays are like $8 or something like that. So
wow,
yeah,
that's amazing.
Yeah,
you're going to sell a lot of people going to Uruguay.
I know. I don't really mean to be doing that, but yeah.
Oh, well, that's good. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was your tweet really intrigued me. And then also the recent episode you had about religion. But this one, the tweet, a big question for me is, if the majority of your tradition has been lost at least a generation or 2 back, what's the best way to rebuild?
Yeah.
So what's the context behind that, and what are some of the solutions you've seen?
Yeah. So I think this is basically probably the question I'm spending my life trying to answer. And the framing of the question is for everything, like every part of our lives: education, marriage, child rearing, vocation, the economy, like spirituality, all of this stuff. And, a little backstory: in my travels, I worked through an organization called WOOF, Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms, which is like it's like a work exchange, where in return for working on organic farms, you get to stay. Sometimes you get food too. And so it's like a cheap way to travel. And so I traveled that way, in my little travel period. And I stayed at a lot of traditional farms, and then I stayed at a lot of places that were like intentional communities or ecological communities or this kind of thing. And I observed that those that did not have the intentional communities that did not have a strong, like, basically set of moral principles, or a sense of what's sacred and profane, or a sense of even something like, how does ownership work? How does governance work? Because people are trying to make so much up from scratch instead of learning from tradition, or pulling from already existing systems that have developed over time, they were just really dysfunctional. And I came to the conclusion that a lot of these attempts at trying to create things from scratch instead of looking to the past and trying to pull from the past, are somewhat foolish and hubristic, in the sense that there's a reason that these systems developed the way that they did, over time, iteratively. Now, so okay, I came up with that understanding. This is my own assumption, being at these different places. So what does that mean in practice? I mean, it doesn't mean go back to all the traditions, or go pick some point in time where the traditions worked perfectly, because they never did. They were always in a context. There was always a trade-off for whatever tradition that existed. And so for me, I'm kind of just trying to explore what learning from the past might mean for a modern person. And which parts, and which are most relevant, and from which time in history, that kind of thing. So we could go through different topic areas if you're interested, or if you want.
Yes, please.
But like, I don't know, you tell me which one. Maybe religion, I don't know which one you would prefer. There's like religion and the family, marriage, child rearing.
So let's talk about culture first. So one of the quotes that I had, that I looked at this week, was David Fleming's quote from Lean Logic, right, on culture. The culture of a community is its art, its music, dance, skills, traditions, virtues, humor, carnival, conventions, and conversations. These give structure and shape to community, like the foundational vertical strands used in basket making, round which you wind the texture of the basket itself, because culture keeps social capital alive and upright, end quote. So one of the things that stood out for me about that was I always thought culture was like the output of those things were the output of culture, right? Dance
Mhm.
was the output of culture. Conversation was the output of culture. But then he's saying that it is the foundation and the spines, if you would, of the basket of culture, right?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I recently I've been thinking a lot about like Ivan Illich's work and Wendell Berry,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like something something that has happened in the modern era. And by modern I would say like the formation of nation states as like our main political borders or whatever, um is that we've sort of continually off put social norms to the state over time.
Sure.
And so instead of expecting our neighbors to uphold social norms, or our family members or extended family or community or tribe or whatever, we just say, we'll just either sue them, or we'll take them to court, or they'll go to jail, and the state will handle enforcing social norms. And I just feel like you give up so much when you don't take some responsibility for embodying whatever those norms are.
Mm-hmm.
You lose so much, and I think people are just now coming to grips with that. And fundamentally, I think culture is I've come up to this realization only very recently, but I think culture is a shared sense of what is sacred and what is profane.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I mean, there are certain things that we think we have this shared understanding that this is a good, and this is not good. We want to avoid this other thing, behavior, activity, just, I don't know, type of living or whatever. And it's really hard to move forward if, one, you don't share that with
Right.
others. It's really hard to like figure out how to move forward if we don't even know really what's good and share that idea. And it also kind of robs people of their agency, both in the sense of um you know taking care of themselves or being self-reliant, but also the sense that creating culture is something you do by enacting it, by embodying it. And so it's this one of these things where culture is getting lost in this process of just assuming, the state can take over. And so I think of like Ivan Illich and conviviality, and it's like sitting around and having a meal together. This is the act of creating culture,
Right.
caring about your neighbor, and not just saying. And the Doomer Optimists are there's several book clubs reading Wendell Berry's The Need to Be Whole,
Mm-hmm.
and there's something here about standing up for your actual neighbor when something unjust is happening to them, as opposed to saying, let's make a top-down policy that solves the problem of justice in the whole country,
Right.
which just seems to be like kind of a form of spreadsheet brain, where it's like, let's look at the statistics and let's make sure that the state enforces justice. And something's really lost if you're not there on the ground noticing when something is unjust and standing in and having the courage to do that. That's like the act of culture being created, are those moments.
Well, and they know that that's going to be death by committee. So 90% of the time they can throw money at it and then it doesn't get done. Right. So I know the concerns of my community, not city community, but my, direct community,
Yeah.
the folks that I know. And it's going to be a lot better than somebody else knows. It's just like when I go to the store lately, all of a sudden they've been pushing this thing round your amount up to the
Yeah.
next $5 or the next dollar. And hey, do you want to donate to XYZ charity and stuff? And it's like, behind the scenes, what happens with that is that they take that money, they sit on it for quarters and sometimes, half a year, collect interest on it. And then the company will make a donation to that charity and they get the tax break from it with your money.
Right.
So it's like,
And
you're not
and like,
doing
and
anything.
no, and so much of this too is like hidden behind the hidden behind the rules of bureaucracy and like lack of transparency. Like, you don't know these organizations personally.
Right.
You can't know what's happening inside of them. And so there is also something where we're in this world where like everything feels sort of unknowable because we're at this scale that is so big, and there's so many ways in which these institutions keep things opaque, that one way to really feel a sense of agency and efficacy in building culture is just working on a scale that's knowable, like building a relationship and loyalty and trust within a knowable, like, you know, Dunbar number type community of people who you can like actually know them individually, and you know the outcome, and you know when their behavior is good, and you know when something unjust is happening. You know, just this knowability is such a huge part of this. You know, we don't really even know how to navigate half of the stuff in the world because it's so opaque to us.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's exactly true. So what are some of the stuff that you were doing, boots on the ground down there in Uruguay, to build a community?
Yeah, so we have a couple of different types of community down here. One is our kids' friends, and this is, you know, this common. It's in some ways I feel embarrassed some of the times when I'm like telling people some of my like insights, because it's just like, if I think about how my parents did things or their parents, all of this is just like common sense. So, but I'm just going to say it anyways, because it feels like sometimes we've lost some common sense. But you know, my kids' friends, parents, you know, we find ways to make friends with other young families whose kids are around the same age, so the kids can play together. They go to school together, or they go to activities together. My kids are in all sorts of activities in the town. They go to the public school, which some people do. I have opinions about schooling and education in general, but part of the reason we moved here because the schools are so wholesome and nice, and a great experience for our kids to, you know, learn a different language and culture, but make friends. We have made some friends through the field school, insofar as we built the field school to uplift local practitioners, whether that's like agroecological small farmers or natural builders, people who are just doing alternative, and sometimes they're like old school conservative environmentalists, and sometimes they're relatively new, like ecological ethic, getting back into like new homesteading similar to the US. And we built the school to sort of meet those people, find out what they need help with on their projects, have the students come volunteer for them. And that the field school has actually helped us solidify some relationships and build some relationships with people we probably wouldn't have explicitly become friends with without that project. And now we know their project, and they're happy to host students because they get volunteer work, and we also pay them for their time for organizing volunteer work. And now, you know, we show up for each other that way. And then there's another third kind of group, which is there's a lot of informal economics that happen here. A lot of people host classes that where you kind of pay out of pocket. They host them out of their house. My kids are in this yoga class that's just out of somebody's house, and it's like a friend of a friend. And we have friends who've opened a children's library, and we're going to go there tomorrow. They have they basically just opened it themselves, this couple, and it's all just run on donation. So there's like these informal economies. We're making community with people by like showing up to their various projects, and just like showing up and we're going to the library, we're taking books out, we're donating, they have a big celebration for their 4-year anniversary tomorrow, we're going to be there, you know, just showing up for people and like being there. When they make an effort to put something out into the world, into the community, you want to see more of that, you got to show up. And right. And so we've been doing that, and it's just so rewarding to see their projects succeed through the act of everybody showing up and supporting it, kind of thing. And so it's just nice. It's a nice way to build a relationship. You're also doing something real. You're not just making a friendship about like, you know, sitting around talking about things you agree about, but instead like we're here together. You know, we brought the student group to work with this library, for example, and the student group they painted the outside of it because it needed a new coat of paint, and
Sure.
it's like we're working on a project together, and that makes them happy. It's great for us to see, to contribute because we believe in their project, and it's just a virtuous cycle that way.
Yeah, that's building social capital. We borrowed the Bitcoin term proof of work. It's also proof of work because you have their back. You've got skin in the game. They know you have skin in the game. So then later on, you'll have that reciprocity, right?
Right.
And
Right.
like my neighbor hurt his back, can't till his garden. So I went and tilled his garden, not because I expect to get anything back, but because of the proof of work of our relationship. And it's surprising with everything going on and people so isolated, and in social media is their community, right? If you ask people, I was pulling some graphics from Pixabay for, the free thing where I can get free graphics for community. And I typed it in community into search, and 90% of it was electronic community. And it's like,
Oh, wow.
that's not the community I'm looking for in this context, right?
Yeah. Right.
And so,
Yeah.
so how do you take the next step and take that and build traditions?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so obviously, like, we're moderns, right? And so it's not, I don't think it's necessary, like I said before, to really like go return to some period of time in the past. But tradition's context specific, I mean, I think here in Uruguay, it's I think the people I've been making friends with on Twitter recently, a lot of them are religious and more traditional, and so they probably wouldn't be super thrilled with this description that I'm going to give, but I'm going to say it anyways. Uruguay has a long tradition of being secular, but it was kind of weird how it happened, and I don't know all of the details of the history, but I do know it was like over 100 years ago when the country secularized all of the national holidays, but right on top of the already existing holidays like Easter and Christmas.
Right.
So they're like, Tourism Week or Day of the Family. So in some ways it was like acknowledging that we take Christmas off to spend time with our families, and anyone who's Christian can do that on Day of the Family. But anyone who's not still is practicing being with their family that day. And so there's a weird thing that happened here where like Christian traditions got secularized but kind of stayed intact because they didn't really demolish the whole all of it. They just sort of labeled it something different and more inclusive and kept all of the activities without calling it explicitly Christian. And so there's like a really big culture here of I mean, it's the most atheist country in Latin America, but there's a lot of Christians still, a lot of practicing Christians, but there's also just like, I think, a Christian morality underlying the culture here, which is like reciprocity, neighborliness, especially there's like a small town culture of like, you don't want to have a bad reputation.
Oh yeah.
You have a bad reputation in a small town, it will bite you in the ass, yeah, I think like this kind of like mutual solidarity or being there for one another. There's also like a kind of culture of voluntary poverty here that's really interesting. Like, I don't know if you know much about Jose Mujica, but he was a former president of Uruguay, and he had a reputation in the world press of being like the world's poorest president, but it was because he gave away most of his salary, like 90% of his salary, and he said, I don't need this big of a salary, I'll just continue living on he lives on a little flower farm outside of the main city, Montevideo. He had like this 3-legged dog, Manuela. He drove this old VW Bug and never updated his car or anything. And he was like a former leftist guerrilla who then there was like a period of dictatorship where he was in jail, like in solitary confinement for 12 years. And then, sort of went into politics, became a senator, became a president, and he said things like, I'm not poor. The people who feel like they need to fill the emptiness in their soul with consumerism, they're the poor ones. I'm rich. I'm rich in my flower farm, in my family, in my dog, and my, I have everything I need, and my contentment is wealth. And so I was thinking, like, wow, a country to be able to elect somebody who says something like that, that's radical. Like, before we came here. And since we came here, I realized, like, yeah, there is a culture of, like, I think not just voluntary poverty, but there really just is not. I know, I'm sure, like, some Uruguayan leftists might, or, like, hardcore leftists might disagree with me, but there is so much less classism here than there is anywhere I've ever been in the world. And
Sure.
honestly, I think the US doesn't have a ton of classism. There's a lot of, like, ability to mix across classes in the US. I was surprised by that when I traveled around the world. There's, like, huge barriers to mixing across classes in a lot of countries, but in Uruguay, it is just there is so much acceptance across class. There's want to be too ostentatious with your wealth, and I feel like that is fundamentally, like, a Christian virtue. And so, anyways, all of that, are traditional cultural artifacts that have made their way into the culture here, that I think are worth continuing on and worth saving. And my sense is that they come from, like, a Christian morality and a Christian sense of, like, the sacred and the profane. I doubt that some of my atheist friends would agree with me, but that's the conclusion I've come to. I think that a lot of this stuff really, we're a Judeo-Christian, Western people are Judeo-Christian, and in culture, it's really hard to break that cultural programming, even if you don't practice going to church.
Atheists are too. They just, they just are in denial. So
yeah.
So I
right.
mean, yeah, that's the culture. If without going down that rabbit hole, I mean, basically, if I was really an atheist, then I really wouldn't care. But they all seem to care. So,
right.
So, and it's interesting because, like, the Perpin, the guy I started with the podcast with, he became Orthodox, and now he's on a monastic path, and he determined that he wanted more than community. He wanted fellowship. And around here, one of the challenges we have, even in the freedom community, is that there's too much of the prepper mindset. Right. So we had our own little festival where we had we pressed apples and made apple cider, and that was awesome. But there was still too many of us that were saying, gee, I like this apple press. I need to see about getting one of my own, and lost the community aspect of it, besides, hey, I'm hanging out with you guys. Right. And, let's make this let's make this a yearly thing. Instead, it all defaults back to, no, I gotta make my own little fiefdom, and stuff. So he was like, Perpin was like, hey, this isn't going far enough for me. He became Orthodox. He moved to the inner city in Kansas City, where there's a Orthodox church and a big community. And now he's on the monastic path, and he's at the monastery right now, and he may not come back. So if he fits in, he won't come back. So, so it's
and I mean, I've always thought that would be a interesting path to take. I just think, like, in general, a path toward service and interdependence is actually necessary. And I've been and however you define that, but interdependence, being reliable to other people, caring for other people, and being cared. I mean, I think it's just completely necessary part of the human condition, and to think that it's not as silly. I mean, I was arguing with someone recently, I don't remember what I said, but they were saying, being able to, I said, the vast majority of people in a healthy culture, the vast majority, so more than 50%, probably more like 60, 70, I don't know exactly the numbers, should be having children, for a society to keep reproducing itself. Basically, it only reproduces itself if you have children. And somebody was arguing back to me, I should be able to choose to do whatever I want to do, and that's not selfish. And I was like, well, I mean, yes, but it is kind of the definition of selfishness to think that you're just atomistic independent actor who has no responsibility to anyone, and who and you don't expect anyone to have a responsibility to you. I mean, that's just, it's very dysfunctional, and a lot of people think that way.
Right.
And it really just doesn't work, because people try it, and then they just keep butting up against limits where you really do need to be interdependent. You have to rely on people. Sometimes you're down on your luck. Sometimes you get sick. Whatever it is, you know, you have to rely on others or be reliable. So just going into it knowing that that's a necessary part of like a functioning life is I think less painful, because I think a lot of people go in thinking I should be able to do whatever I want, and then they make choices that aren't toward service or interdependence towards others, and they get frustrated because they keep hitting roadblocks, because they are just thinking they can completely themselves, and it's just impossible, really.
Mm-hmm. Or they constantly search for meaning, and then that is meaning, but it's so
Right.
for better words, anti-American, right? So
Yeah.
it's
Yep.
definitely not American to think like that at this point. So it's interesting. So what are some of the other tips you have for building traditions and culture that way?
Yeah. So another thing I've been thinking a lot about recently is the idea of family and marriage as an institution for building culture. So Mary Harrington is a British author, and she just wrote a book called Feminism Against Progress. And she and I have become friendly via Twitter, and she interviewed me for the end of her book. And basically her argument is that economic incentives and technology, now without getting into all the details of what I mean by that, are really what have made things hard on women in marriages and family, more so than anything like the patriarchy. It's really the incentives of work outside the home, and like, you know, wage labor, and you know, this kind of expectation that we're just independent actors, atomistic actors, like we were saying. And one way to, I think, rebuild that in the modern era without going back to like the 50s, or without going back to the point before women had the right to vote or anything like that, is to think of marriage as a culture building institution, and to think of marriage as a tool, a social tool to kind of build a project together, a life together, and to, if possible, make the family part of your life's vocation. And by that I mean, you know, being independent actors and just having I think the way marriage is approached now is you're two independent actors, your career is primary, having a marriage and kids is kind of like top of your larger life's vocation, which is to have a career, to, I guess, make as much money before you die or something. And instead to think about marriage as the primary vocation and project of life, and to think of work as secondary, but to think about like raising your kids as the central project of your life, building a home, building a culture of your family out of which you expect your kids to then take that culture into the world. Like in our case, we bought this land that we're trying to develop into something that could potentially be a home for our kids if they want it. We right now, Patrick, my husband, is out there. We have this old building on the property. I think it's from the 1920s. And he's out there like renovating it, and we're going to use that building as like a hangout room and a music space for our kids. But you know, eventually could be a building on the property. We're just slowly building sort of a legacy on this property that's like the way we think about it, and this is very traditional, a traditional way to think about it, as we're building a legacy that, so that our gene is not, like, sounds very biological, but our genes get passed on the more we set our kids up for success in having their own families and succeeding in their lives. And so our project is primarily about raising our kids well, educating them well, passing on our family culture, but also developing this property and potentially maybe another property, I don't know, for them and getting them set up in their lives. And so just thinking about building a legacy, I think is a total mind shift from the way most people think about marriage now, which is, I guess like some kind of way in which you feel self-fulfillment or something. But
Right.
instead to think, wow, look at actually how romantic it can be to think about like my strengths and his strengths together, making these children and making this project on this land and this property. We're actually much stronger together with building this project than we would be as independent economic actors. I don't know, I guess making as much money or getting as much notoriety as possible in our careers or whatever. And so, yeah, that's one way that we're like kind of looking back to a tradition, but bringing it into the modern era of thinking like, I really just want to, I want to think about our marriage as a project, and I want to think about the legacy I can leave my kids,
Wow. That's great. It's funny to watch folks engage with you, and then you say something like that and they go right wing, right wing, right wing, and they
I
go
know.
nuts. It's
I
hilarious.
know. I know. And like I honestly think like what so much of my young adult development has been like left leaning in the sense of like, the economy is built against us. Probably my earlier days I would say it's all capitalism or whatever, but I wouldn't probably use those terms anymore, but it's like it is out there to really kind of exploit and alienate us fundamentally, the way that it's set up now. And so taking back these institutions is empowerment against that, against the atomization and alienation brought on by the economy and technology. And so I don't understand how that's not in accordance with like all my values that made me quote unquote left wing when I was younger, but now it's right wing to say something like build a legacy for your kids,
Right,
get them
right.
set up in life. I don't know. I really just can't keep track of like these labels.
And the goalposts keep moving, right? And it's
Yeah.
like, well, no, you can't have stuff now.
No, I know. I know.
You got to
I
eat
know.
the bugs. So,
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Or even just owning property, like, a lot of people say, oh, you're just so privileged to be able to own property. Like, our land was not very expensive. I made $13,000 as a grad student. My husband made mid five figures as a high school teacher. We were not wealthy in by any stretch of the imagination, and we were able to do this because, and of course I'm still relatively in the world population in the top 1%, of course, in comparison to the world, but relative to most other like middle class Americans, I think a lot of people just want to tell themselves that the whole structural system has to change for them to have any agency. And for me, the big message of a lot of the exploration I'm doing is to say, if I can do it, a lot of people can do it.
right.
A vast majority of people can do it. We have not come from any special privilege relative to a lot of other people who are very similar to us. I would say probably the vast majority of Americans. And people do really want to make excuses, and they don't want to think about all the ways in which they could potentially have agency. And it's really, if my message is anything, it's just empower them to say, it's really not that hard, and it's actually quite rewarding once you try it.
Wow, that's great. Excellent. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I've been thinking about education a little bit recently. I might as well just get it out while I'm thinking about it while I have the platform. I think that I guess I should say this as a backup. The building of tradition is something that should be place specific. So like I was saying, in Uruguay, we have these traditions that are place specific to this place. I would say in the US, I might like join a church. Like I probably would have already joined a church to try to find some of these people who have shared the same value system as me. So
Sure.
again, I think it's like the strategy should be place specific. I feel the same way about education. I think in some places the education system is so messed up, and I think it's probably true in like Chicago where I'm from, that I would homeschool. But my school here is wonderful, and I think sending my kids here is a really good choice. And so I think another main point I'm trying to get across when it comes to building your own traditions is that there is not a one size fits all answer. It's going to be locally specific. It's going to have to do with what resources you have available to you in your person, in your marriage, in your area, and so I think that's really important, because people sometimes say they want to be told like a kind of list, do this and this, go do homeschooling, do homestead. Well, I think, and for a lot of people living in a city, and you can have a small little container garden, and that's fine, that's enough for you, and then you get involved in knowing your farmer and that kind of thing. There's a huge ways to do permaculture in the suburbs. You don't have to get onto some land. You don't have to necessarily join a church. There's like an active Grange organization that gets you into the kind of culture that you want. So I would just say to encourage people to like sort of pick a place, commit to it, pick some people, and start, developing traditions that like but based on the resources of your specific place. So my kids go to school, but the education question is going to be specific to whatever you have. If it's really bad where you are, the way I see building tradition and education is, I would love to see, and I see it's happening already, people start homeschooling, and then they start forming homeschooling co-ops. Then they start to form these like more regular like forest schools, or then they have like these dates where parents are teaching classes, and they're all like elective classes, and those are like turning and forming into schools themselves. And sometimes it's then a school that's 3 days a week or something like that. And this is like the way alternative institutions get built. And it starts with first saying, I just can't do the mainstream institution, I have to get out. There's a period of adaptation, and then the people kind of find each other and build together. And so that's really that's the theory of change of how the traditions get built. It's that way. It's like first you secede from something, then you find the others who did it, or find others who resonate with you, and then you build something alternative to that. Having said that, Neil Clark is a guy on Twitter who lives in Maine, and his public school is worth sending his kids to, and he says worth saving. I feel the same way about our public school here in Uruguay. I think going to this public school is an act of institution building itself. If you can get into this institution and it's worth not seating, then you get into it and you get involved and you get on the school board, and you really go all in on like putting all of your resources as an individual or a family behind that institution. And so anyways, there's just not a one size fits all approach to tradition building. It's got to be, fundamentally, you really are the one who has the agency and the ability to decide for yourself if it resonates with you, and where to put your resources, and where to be interdependent, because you're gonna necessarily, I said earlier, you have to be interdependent, so you might as well pick and choose who you want to be interdependent with.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that and especially if the kids do stay in the public school, is develop a life of learning, and we just don't see that. So I mean, I used to read voraciously when I was a kid, even when I didn't have to. So, but maybe it's because of I had less. Maybe I had that space, and giving space, and then giving the sense of place and things like that as well. Can help build that in kids, because that's everybody's missing the sense of meaning, and part of it is the sense of place, the sense of the seasons, and everything else. So
and I would say, like with school, part of the reason we moved here is I was studying the sociology of education and looking at like the ways in which schools were approaching students, like specifically industrial, like large scale public schools. Like there's all coming out like where standardized tests are basically like determining how schools get funded.
Mhm.
So then you're just teaching to the test, and it is the most spreadsheet brain thing imaginable. Like everybody just has to conform to this very narrow set of measurable outcomes that do not at all like line up with the variance in kids' interests or curiosity or personalities or disposition. And for a lot of kids are really a difficult way to learn, like learning these spreadsheet type standardized tests type learning. And then if they don't conform to that type of learning, they put them on these drugs. Like it's just widespread. Putting kids on like psychoactive drugs early in their lives, that was terrifying to me. And so the other thing just to think about with schools and other institutions in general is the first step you got to do when you're trying to build exposure to things that will cause you active harm. And then once you've gotten yourself out and you're just like in survival mode, then you have to get your feet under you. And this is I'm like describing part of our journey moving to Uruguay. And once you've gotten some stability, got your feet under you, then you can move toward something that is your podcast, Thriving the Future. You're not just surviving, you're thriving at that point. You're seeking out things that resonate with you. And we're finally starting to get into that mode with our kids, after having 3 young kids and moving to a new country and starting a business. And I'm talking backwards, I make it sound really easy, but the process of adaptation of like first minimizing exposure. Before we left Chicago, there were like Donald Trump was just elected, and there was like a palpable sense of like team sports, like like neighbors against neighbors. There was this shooting in this neighborhood that we're from in Chicago between an off-duty police officer and a guy who was not from the neighborhood, a white off-duty police officer and a black guy driving through the neighborhood. And there was just this sense of like, like this could erupt into like not feeling like a safe place to be with kids. And it's like leveled off since then, and doesn't feel as palpable. But the first thing is get out of these institutions, get away from these places where you could be actively harmed just by being around. And then after that, try to seek these alternatives that are potentially places to look for tradition and look to the past. And I think just be a model too. That's another piece of advice. Just the other day I saw old videos of my family members. I remember this. There's like, the generation older than me, they're like putting pictures on and videos on Facebook to try to like capture some of the family videos. And I remember when we went to Christmas at my grandma's house, all the adults who were like my age in their 30s, young 30s, like, but mostly in their late 20s and 30s, there's videos, they're just dancing the whole evening, dancing, and the kids are playing in the other room, or whatever, Nerf guns or whatever they got for Christmas. And that was us. We were playing around, but everybody else was just dancing all night, and other people are sitting and talking to each other. This wasn't that long ago where this was the culture, where everybody's just in the living room dancing and laughing, and I'm drinking and smoking cigarettes and all this kind of stuff. And I just think it would be cool to kind of go out on a limb and try to make that kind of culture happen, even if it feels awkward for our generation, and so I was just thinking that the other day I saw those videos, and I just thought, next Christmas, if I'm around, I should just put some music on and see if someone will dance. And you can take a leap of faith sometimes with those kind of cultural things. People want to have fun, and it just takes a little bit of some weirdos to try to bring it back. But I think people will come along if you're sincere and joyful enough. I don't know. So I'll let you know if I try.
That's great.
If it fails or succeeds.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being the guest today.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me.
Sure. Let me hit the recording.